Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. This is the last webinar of our winter series of Congressional Academy Live. Tonight, we're talking about handicap principles, and we will address the MSGA, the Maryland State Golf Association's move to the GIN system. We're not going to talk too much about that because there's a lot of handicap principles that I want to get into, but the goal tonight, if you watch the first handicap webinar back in January, that was more what I would describe as like an appetizer for handicaps. And tonight is going to be more meat and potatoes. We're going to get into some pretty in-depth concepts, and I'm going to do my best to try and make it as simple and understandable as possible. But this is going to be a bit of how the sausage is made, how handicaps are calculated behind the scenes, and there's going to be a lot going on in some of these topics. And so please, at any time, if you have questions, please let me know. I'm going to go to the next slide here. Just a couple of reminders. Use the chat or the Q&A function if you do have questions. For technical support, if you have Zoom issues, please email Chris Nieto, cnieto@cucclub.org. And as with all the webinars that we've done, this is the fourth one. This is being recorded, so it'll be on the club website for future reference, or if you want to send it to someone that wasn't able to attend tonight. And let's get into it. The topics that we're going to address. The first one is we're going to talk about two concepts for score posting adjustments. So things that are in place when a score maybe is extraordinary or isn't in line with what you normally would shoot. There's some adjustments that are in place. There's some handicap safeguards, things that are in place to keep a handicap from going up too quickly. Some recommended handicap allowances for various forms of play. A stroke index allocation. This is something that we talked about a little bit in the first webinar. I've done a lot more research on it, and I have a better understanding of it now, so I want to share some of that knowledge with you all. And how is par is determined, we'll talk a little bit about that. And then lastly, just the GIN system and Maryland State's process of switching over to it, what that means for you all. So the first thing in terms of score posting adjustments, we talked about this in the first webinar. I want to talk more in depth about it tonight. So the playing conditions calculation, when adverse weather conditions or abnormal course setup causes scores to be unusually high or low on a given day, a playing conditions calculation will adjust score differentials to better reflect the player's actual performance. There's a lot. Don't worry, I'm going to break that down. We'll make that a little bit more easier to understand. There's some big words in there. The PCC is simple and conservative in nature, and it'll be adjusted in integer values, meaning whole numbers. So it won't be any decimal points. Okay, what does that paragraph or two paragraphs all mean? So basically, the playing conditions calculation is in place for when either conditions were very difficult or a course setup was very easy, and there were a lot of scores that were outside what we would call the expected score. There's a whole algorithm that you can go on usga.org that allows you to calculate the probability that a player of a certain index would shoot. And expected score is essentially the expected range that each player score should fall into based on their handicap. So these are the 7 steps according to the handicap manual of how the playing conditions calculation is calculated. So step number 1, calculate and this all happens automatically through the handicap system. But step 1 is calculate the expected score for each eligible player, meaning based on their handicap, approximately what range of score they should have shot. And then calculate the expected, what we call standard deviation of score differentials. I'm going to talk about what score differentials are in a second, so don't get too hung up on that. Incorporate all applicable slope ratings, meaning the slope and rating of the tees that every person played. And then establish how many players scored better or worse than the expected score on the day. And then number 4 is really the big key. The proportion of players submitting a score equal to, better, or worse than their expected score range determines whether a PCC is going to, adjustment is going to be required. Okay, so again, it can be higher or lower. The adjustment can go up in either direction. And if the adjustment is required, determine how much easier or how much harder the golf course played that day. And then based on those calculations, determine any final PCC adjustment required for play that day. So there's a lot going on there. Essentially, if more players were either shot a better score than like outside their expected range than did not, or more players shot a worse score outside their expected range than not, it's possible that a PCC is going to be added that day. First question coming through, is there a minimum number of golfers that have to play on a particular course before a PCC is done? Yes, I'm gonna move to the next slide here. There is a couple points here, but there has to be at least 8 acceptable scores posted on a golf course for the PCC to potentially come into play. It's generally only performed once per day. I read in the handicap manual the circumstances that it potentially would happen more than once in a day, and it's highly unlikely. The 2 circumstances or examples that they give are on a day when potentially the weather in the morning versus the weather in the evening or afternoon, I should say, were incredibly different. And so an example for that, let's say it's really, really windy, very difficult in the morning, and then it's clear blue skies, and let's say because it was so windy in the morning, the superintendent moved the tees up and the course was set up much easier, and you have a ton of people that performed better than their expected range in the afternoon and worse than their expected range in the morning because of how hard it was. So the morning group would be calculated as having played, their differential will be marked down because they had an inflated score. And the group that played really well, their differential would be marked up because they actually played better than expected. Next question we have is, do you know how the PCC will be displayed by the GIN system? Will it appear as a separate column near our actual score? Yes, it will. And I actually have a slide that's going to show, because there's one other adjustment that I'm going to talk about next, and then I have a slide that's going to show exactly how this is all going to be displayed on your scoring record when you can look it up on GIN. So great question. I'm going to show exactly what that looks like here in a second. Again, just some notes about the PCC. It's generally performed only once per day. Talked about those. Considered acceptable scores submitted on the golf course each day and requires at least 8 of those acceptable scores. Interesting thing, this third point includes only acceptable scores submitted by players with a handicap index of 36.0 or below, which I found interesting. I didn't realize that. The max handicap index is 54. So when they were sitting down and figuring out the different stipulations, people over a 36 index, because my guess is, my hunch is, the reason they have this is if you have a higher index, you probably have a greater variability about how you're going to play. And so didn't want that to potentially throw off the data for how difficult or easy a golf course played in a particular day. If there are fewer than 8 acceptable scores, regardless of what the conditions were like, there's not going to be a PCC calculated that day. Where applicable, this does not include scores that are scaled up to 9-hole or 18-hole scores. What that means is, let's say you only played 7 holes and you post a 9-hole score, so you did net par for your remaining 2 holes. That really shouldn't be included. I pulled this bullet point directly from the handicap manual. I couldn't find anywhere that said how they would determine, like how does the system know whether it got scaled up or whether it was just posted, the person did it themselves and posted it? I don't know exactly the answer to that, and I couldn't find it anywhere in the handicap manual, but that bullet point is in there. The next or score posting adjustment is called the exceptional score reduction. This is a procedure for dealing with exceptional scores, which may indicate the player's true ability. The procedure considers all scores rather than only tournament scores. So tournament scores are no longer utilized in the new handicap system, but that was very prevalent prior to the World Handicap system, meaning that if you played in a tournament, you had to post it as a tournament score and it would stay in your scoring record for a year. And if it was outside of your range, meaning it was better than what you were normally expected, it's possible that you would manually your index would be manually adjusted by your state golf association, and you'd see an R next to your index, meaning that it was reduced. No longer just looking at tournament scores, now we're looking at all scores. And how does this work? You calculate, again, when you see that word score differential, once the score is posted and the playing condition calculation is applied when appropriate, calculate what the new handicap index is, and if the score differential is 7 strokes or better than the handicap index from where the round was played, you're going to apply this table reduction, which is here on the right side of this page. Okay, what the heck is score differential? I've said it several times. It's comparing the score you shot with the rating of the course and tees that you played. So we're going to just use a very basic example. We're going to say someone that's a 10 index. Let's say that they shot a 68 or let's say a 68. Like a 10 handicap goes out and shoots a 68. Okay, and the slope and rating the rating was 72. Okay, so they shot a 68. Their differential is actually, if you take 72 minus 68, it's +4, right? And their index is 10. So the difference between their index and the actual the differential is 14. Okay, so let's look at our table here. The score differential relative to index. The score differential is 14 and our index is 10. So that means that, it was more than 10 strokes lower, right? So it's 14, so it's +10. So there's actually going to be a deduction of -2 for that score differential. And let me go to the next slide here to make it a little more understandable. So we've got and this gets back to the last question about how a PCC is displayed. So this is just an example of what someone's scores look like on GIN. So you've got the date, the score, the course slope and rating, and the differential here. So again, the differential has to do with the course rating and the score posted. If, let's say there was a playing calculation adjustment, it would be in this PCC column and you would see it there. And if they had an exceptional score reduction, it would be in this column all the way to the right. So it's going to be visible. You're not going to have to guess whether your scores have been reduced at all. It will be displayed right there. So both the PCC and the exceptional score reduction are in place to make sure that a player's score accurately reflects their ability, and that outside source. So the PCC is for outside influences, not artificially afflicting a player's score. And the equitable or exceptional score reduction is to make sure that the player's exceptional performance is not is taken into account, is that even though it doesn't align with some of the other scores, it's weighted more heavily. Hopefully that all makes sense. Don't see any other questions coming through. Okay, the next thing is we're to talk about is handicap safeguards. So what things that are in the system to make sure that your handicap does not go up too quickly. So the first piece of this is the memory of the low handicap index. And that is defined as it represents the demonstrated ability of a player over a 365-day period preceding the most recent score in the player's scoring record, and provides a reference point against which the current handicap index can be compared. Okay, so in more plain English, over the last 365 days, whatever your lowest handicap index is, that is marked. There's a bookmark on that on your scoring record, and then we'll get into the next piece of this puzzle. I do have a question that just came in. It's possible that a PCC score or a exceptional score reduction score might not be used in the calculation of a current index. Correct. So the way that your current index is calculated is that it is your best 8 scores out of your most recent 20 scores. So it's possible that either the PCC or your equitable stroke control, or sorry, I keep saying equitable stroke control, but that's in the old system. Your exceptional score reduction might not be used because it might not be lower. Now, it's unlikely. I think it's more likely that there would be a PCC adjustment and it wouldn't be used in calculating your index than an exceptional score reduction and it not be used for your index, because in that case you had a very good score, whereas the PCC could be a really high score or a low score. So more likely that the PCC score adjustment is not in the top 8 versus the exceptional score reduction. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so we've got our low index, and then the next piece of this puzzle is what we call the cap procedure. Okay, there's a soft cap and a hard cap, which will be implemented to limit the extreme upward movement of a player's handicap within a 365-day period. Okay, so remember, we've got that the memory of the low index over a 365 period. Once our handicap has gone up 3 strokes within that 365 period, there's going to be a soft cap on our index. And what that means is that anytime our index is supposed to go up again, it's only going to go up by half of what the calculation is. And I've got an example on the next slide that will make it a little bit easier to understand. Once we hit a 5-stroke increase from that original low handicap index, once we've reached an increase of 5 strokes, there's going to be a hard cap, meaning your handicap will not go up anymore during that period. So let's move to, and that last piece there, sorry. These only start to take effect once you have at least 20 scores in your scoring record. So looking at this diagram, we've got our low handicap index, that's 20. And we start playing not the best golf, our index starts to go up. Once our index hits 23, it's now increased by +3. The soft cap is triggered. And so now every time our handicap goes up from there, it only goes up by half. Once we hit the increase in May, we hit the increase of 5, there's a hard cap, and our handicap is not going to go up anymore from there. Now, eventually, obviously time is linear, eventually that low handicap index reference point is going to be outside that 365-day window. And the cap is going to reset. Okay, so let's just, for the sake of this argument, once we get into July, moving linearly, it's not on this graph, but once we were getting July, the cap would reset, and then the index would be able to go up again because 20.0 would no longer be the low handicap index. I find this chart really easy. It makes it much easier to understand the soft cap versus the hard cap. If you're just trying to think about it just conceptually, it doesn't always make the most sense. So this chart is, I feel really helpful in breaking down the difference between the two. Next up is handicap allowances. So these are things that the USGA has recommended for various strokes of play, basically potentially reducing what your handicap is. And if you played in a golf tournament that had a net component to it, you may have seen your course handicap and then a lower number, which was the number of strokes you were getting. And that was based on this table. So we've got stroke play, match play, and then other. So other would be some of your more uncommon forms of play, but just for your reference here, individual stroke play, and most of these individual stroke play in terms of Stableford, bogey par, max score, they are all 95%. Getting into four ball, so four ball will be defined as you have a partner and you're playing the best score of the two of you. That's 85%, and that includes Stableford and bogey par as well. Do you have, looks like someone raised their hand. Let's see, Tina Mather, do you have a question? I'm gonna turn your mic on here.
No, it was a mistake, sorry.
Oh, okay, all right, just making sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And match play, individual match play, so that's one versus one. Everyone should get 100% of their handicap. Four ball, we recommend reducing that to 90%. Foursomes, so foursomes is alternate shot. Foursomes is one of those words that has become very common vernacular in golf, but it doesn't actually, like, the technical term refers to alternate shot as opposed to just a group of four people playing golf. And the recommended there is 50% of the combined team handicap. So if you have two players, one's a 5, one's a 10, their combined handicap is 15, and then you just divide that in half. So it's going to be 7.5, and you'll round up to 8. Green sums is basically, it's a term that I hadn't heard before. I had to look it up. It's essentially select drive alternate shot. So if you and your partner would both tee off and then pick the best ball and then alternate in from there, versus traditional alternate shot, which is where one player tees off the odd holes, one player tees off the even holes. And then the different forms of one best ball of 4, two best ball of 4, three best ball of 4, and then total aggregate, all 4 balls in play. I had not seen that format played before, but these are some of the more traditional, like, member guest groups of 4 formats. Okay, stroke index allocation. I learned a lot about this researching it after the last webinar, and I wanted to share some more information about it. So the recommended methodology and procedure for determining a stroke index allocation within the 6 triad structure designed to accommodate both stroke play and match play formats, and it follows. Now, when it says 6 triad structure, what that means is the first 3 holes are a triad, the second 3 holes are a triad, and the next 3 holes on the front 9 are a triad, and then same thing on the back 9. So you've got each 9 is broken up into 3 triads or groups of 3. I'm not sure why they try to use such fancy terminology. Ooh, I just went ahead, but that's what that means. And the goal ultimately when determining what the stroke index allocation is, and that's how the handicap holes are distributed on the scorecard. My overall understanding was that it always had more to do with the difference in scores from better players and higher handicap players. And that's part of it, but it actually, there's a lot more to it because the goal is to spread the strokes out somewhat evenly over the 18 holes. So you see, like the first bullet point, you apply odd stroke indexes over the front nine, even over the back nine. That's pretty typical. If the back nine is significantly more difficult than the front nine, you can flip-flop that. I have yet to see a scorecard that has that. But usually the number one handicap holes on the front and the number two handicap holes on the back. You want to spread the stroke index allocation evenly over the 18 holes so that players receiving strokes will have the opportunity to use a high proportion of these strokes before a match result is decided, meaning you don't want to heavy load the strokes or onto the back nine or the front nine. You want it to be fairly even. That's why all the evens are on the back and all the odds are on the front. Apply the lowest stroke index hole, so 1 or 2 on each nine in the middle triad. So the number one handicap hole, it's recommended that that is either hole 4, hole 5, or hole 6. And the number two handicap hole should either be hole 13, 14, or 15. So it's not necessarily the hole that has the highest difference between better players and high handicap players. It's actually supposed to more traditionally be the fourth, fifth, or sixth hole. That I did not realize that before really digging into this concept. If no hole within the middle triad is ranked within the lowest 6 holes relative to par, so that gets into the difficulty, then it can be moved into an adjacent hole at the end of the first triad or the beginning of the third triad on each nine. So if the 3 middle holes on the 9 are really easy relative to better players and high handicap players, then you could potentially have the number one stroke hole be on hole 3 or on hole 7, and the number two stroke hole be on hole 12 or be on hole 16. But it's recommended that they're in that middle triad. I just got a comment, my brain hurts. I feel you. It is definitely not always the most easy thing to wrap my head around. I've read through this many times over the last month or so, and I'm still trying to understand it. So I feel you. Apply the second lowest stroke index on each nine to either the first or third triad, and I won't get bogged down so much, but essentially these are in place to try and spread it out. And it's, there's a lot more to it instead of just the difficulty of the hole. So if you're going to take anything away from this page, I would say take away the fact that it's not purely based on the difficulty of the hole, number one, and it's not purely based on how much easier it is for a scratch golfer versus a 30 handicap. It actually has to do with spreading those strokes out evenly throughout the round. Let's go to the next slide here. A little more simpler topic here, establishing par. It's important that an accurate par be established for each hole on the golf course for both men and women. And these are the recommended par ranges or length of hole ranges for par. Okay. I think the reason I bring this up, I think it's interesting that sometimes, and this is rare, but sometimes you might see the women's tees or the forward tees are actually ahead of the men's tees. The last club I worked at was in the Boston area, and the 18th hole, the red tees were behind the men's tees. And the reason for that is the recommendation is that, and at the time, it's actually changed now, but at the time, the recommendation was that a par 5 for ladies should be at least 400 yards. So, and it was a par 4 for men. So in order to get to that 400-yard minimum, the tees for the ladies were behind the men's tees. I've got a couple questions here. Let's see if we can get into this. The key first question is about the stroke index allocation. The key concept of stroke index allocation, as I understand it, is this: strokes don't indicate what the hardest hole is. It has to do with where a high handicap player will need a stroke to be competitive and a low handicap player. Correct. Yeah, it is trying to spread it out to make it so that the player receiving the strokes isn't going to get them all in one bunch and then not receive them the rest of the round. It's trying to spread them out, and it's more about the match itself as opposed to just an individual person playing. And yes, these yardages have changed over time as technology has increased. I don't know the exact how much they've changed exactly, but it has changed. I do have another person who has raised their hand. I don't know if that is a mistake or not, but I'm gonna unmute you, Dave Malinak. I'm gonna turn your mic on. Did you mean to?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to jump off that question.
Yeah.
I'm relatively new to golf and don't know a ton about handicaps, and I also missed the first session. So could you quickly go over how many strokes are given per hole based on handicap and how that relates to the rank of each hole?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just give for the sake of simplicity, I can use round numbers here. So let's say you've got a scratch golfer and they're playing against a 10 handicap, okay? And for this example, it doesn't matter whether it's match play or stroke play. So when these two players go out onto the golf course and play against each other, the 10 handicap is going to receive 10 strokes throughout that 18-hole match. And the stroke index allocation lets the players know what holes that the 10 handicap receives those strokes on. So they're going to receive strokes on the holes that are 1 through 10 on this stroke index allocation. So when you look at at the scorecard, you'll see the top columns usually what the hole numbers, and then the yardages from the various tees, what par is, and then you'll see handicap, and those numbers don't match up with the hole numbers. Those are spread around. So if you're trying to figure out as a 10 handicap, you look at which of those holes in that handicap column have a number 10 or less. Those are the holes that you're going to get a stroke on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And at an 18 handicap, does it wrap back around so that at the number 1 handicap hole, then there's 2 strokes?
Yeah. So if let's say you're not competing against an individual person, but it's an overall stroke play competition. You're a 19 handicap, right? So you get 1 stroke per hole, and then you've got that additional stroke. You're going to get a second stroke on the number 1 handicap hole. So it does wrap around, and like a 36 handicap is going to get 2 strokes on each hole. A 37 handicap would get 2 strokes on each, or sorry, a 35 handicap would get 2 strokes on each hole except for the number 18 handicap hole. And they would only get 1 stroke on that.
All right, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. Great question. Thanks for jumping in. Got a few more questions here. Will the club require some or all golfers to post hole-by-hole scores on the new blue for some period of time to help with stroke allocation? Yes. I mean, we're going to work in conjunction with Maryland State to make sure we're going through the proper procedures. In terms of when the golf course opens, and I talked through this with Jason Epstein after the first webinar, it's pretty likely, I think, that we're going to keep the stroke allocation the way it was on the old course. And again, we're going to use MSGA as a resource to help guide us through that process. But I think that to start, we'll probably stick with the way we had it before, and we're going to lean on them as the experts because they go around the whole state and help golf courses do this all the time, to walk us through that process. Great questions coming through here. Come on, there we go. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the par 6, right? I thought, is that even a thing? So I Googled par 6s in the States. I got this nice top 10 list. I thought this was just a little more of a trivia than anything else. You look at how long some of these holes are. I think the longest one there in Virginia is 841 yards. I personally have never played a golf course that had a par 6. But I think there's actually some that have par 7s. I found out in some of my Googling. That obviously is not on the USGA spreadsheet there. Par 7s are even more of a novelty than a par 6 is, but there's enough par 6s out there that they have a top 10 list. And okay, so the last topic here is the MSGA's move to GIN. GIN, it's just an acronym for the Golf Handicap Information Network. It's a service provided by the USGA to golf associations. GIN is one of the largest handicap management tools in the world. It serves 2.3 million golfers, which is a pretty astonishing number, and over 1,500 golf clubs. So it's really exciting that we've joined this overall network, because the old system that we were in, GolfNet, was just a much smaller pool. So in terms of verifying handicaps from other places, we didn't have access to the GIN system before. So for events like the member guest, or trying to make sure someone's handicap is legitimate, it was harder to get that information. In terms of the process for transferring from GolfNet to GIN, all of your data and scores were transferred back in December and January. Scores that were more than 2 years old, you might not see those, but all recent scores from the last 2 years, and then anything in 2021 was transferred, including, most importantly, your most recent 20 scores. All of you should have received an email to register for what GIN refers to as your digital profile on January 28th. And once you had set that up, you should have access to the GIN system. If you haven't gotten that email, please call the golf shop. It's an easy thing for us to send to you to make sure you're have your login credentials and are able to post scores. The one thing that didn't carry over were statistics from a GolfNet profile. They weren't transferred over due to differences in the ways that they track and measure statistics. So that's a bummer if you were paying attention to that. But it just means you got to play a lot of golf for the next couple months to be able to build your stats back up. The GIN golfer products will not allow you to post scores in Maryland or any other states that have inactive seasons. The inactive season in Maryland is from the 15th of November, and it carries through until the 14th of March. So if you had accidentally posted a score in Maryland, or let's say, I'll use Massachusetts as an example, just because I know that they have an inactive season, that was not carried over. So the GIN in that transfer made sure that score didn't get calculated. Someone just asked, will the seasonal cost to maintain a handicap be the same under GIN? Yes. Maryland State did not increase the cost, which is great. In my mind, it almost should be cheaper because they have so many more people using it, but the state has not increased what that charge is. And then I've got, again, I'm getting my keyboard gets a little sticky at times, trying to advance. There we go. All right, member action items. So meaning, what do you need to do to make sure you're up and running with Gin? Again, you need to set up that digital profile. If you did not get your number or your email address to set that up, please let us know. Call the golf shop. Make sure you download the Gin app and then wait patiently until March 15th, because if you're playing in Maryland, it's an inactive season. And make sure you play and you post your scores. Just had a question come through for the end, so I'm going to wait until that to address it. Let's see here. Make sure you download the Gin app. It has a great look to it. I think it's going to be, I'm really excited that we've made this switch. I think it's well past time for the Maryland State to kind of join the modern handicap world with the Gin system. So I'm excited about that. And thank you so much for attending. I do have a question that I'm going to answer here. For the end, any update on the blue course? Are we still on schedule to open in mid-June? And has this month of snow and wet delayed construction? It looks like 11 and 6 are the last two holes to finish. Great question. It's been a popular one. Obviously, the conditions in February have not been ideal for golf instruction or golf at all. As of this point, the construction team is still very confident they're going to be able to get everything completed. Based on talking to Pete Went, the superintendent, and he's got a lot of construction experience. He was the project manager at Kinloch when Kinloch was being built. As long as the last piece of turf is hitting the ground by the end of March, early April, we should still be on target for that mid-June, or I would say early June open date. Now, hoping that spring temperatures cooperate, and a lot of that is just up to Mother Nature, but at this point, still confident that we're going to be in a good place. 6 needs to be had the irrigation put in. They need to do the final, what we call fine grading, and then the turf is going to be ready to go down. And the team is filling in. There's a big erosion pit on 11. If you remember that big pit that was in front of 18 green for most of the season, that it's a sediment control. There's one last one on the property, and that's on 11. That needs to be filled in. And so once that gets filled in, they're going to be able to pretty quickly sod the rest of that hole. So still on target. Hopefully we are playing the blue course and talking about how great it is only a few short months from now. Someone did ask, when will the range be open again? I'm hoping tomorrow. I walked out there yesterday afternoon. I mean, there's almost an inch of standing water on the range. So I'm hoping today's wind and weather at some point tomorrow will be able to open up. And I know today was torturous. I felt so bad that we weren't able to get people out there. There was still some snow actually on some of the greens. So hopefully tomorrow we'll be good to go. But I know everyone is going to be glad to see the cold weather get behind us, and it'll be too hot before we know it. We'll be complaining that it's too humid and want to go into the air conditioning. Thank you so much, everybody, for hopping on. Great questions. Hopefully everyone took away from some stuff. I know we got into some pretty meaty concepts here tonight, so thanks for bearing with me. Please let me know any feedback you think that would improve these webinars. We're going to do them moving forward. Hopefully we can do them in person at some point, maybe this year, but trying to make them as interesting as possible. But if you have feedback for me, you think that it would make it a little bit more easier to understand, or things that you want covered, please let me know, and I'd be happy to do that. And yes, if you would like the slides for these or for any of the presentations that I've done, please let me know. I'll be happy to shoot those to you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great, it looks like I got one more question here. So Dave, I think you've raised your hand again. Let me,
Yeah, I
You-
figured while I had you, I'd just ask one more super basic question
Absolutely.
about handicaps. Sure. At a very basic level, I'm not actually 100% sure even how the handicap score is calculated. I think you mentioned it in passing, but if you could go over that briefly again, I'd appreciate it.
so when you say, you're talking about how the handicap index is calculated?
Yep, correct.
So it's a calculation of, and I'm actually here. I'm gonna go off book here for a second. You can see my screen. So I'm gonna pull up the USGA. This is the handicap manual, but I want to show you the actual or I guess the best way to say it is basically just the formula. So calculation of a handicap index. Here we go. Okay, there should be. I might need to go back a step here. Yeah, here we go. So for an 18-hole score, you've got, and can you see this? Is that coming up there?
I cannot currently. I think you might be sharing one particular screen.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna do new share. There we go. All right. How's that?
Good.
You see it now? Okay, cool.
Yep.
All right, so for an 18-hole score, so I've got the score differential, which we talked about, where it's whatever the rating of the tees you played, minus, or your score minus the rating. That's how we get the score differential. And then, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. So that's the adjusted gross score. So that's in the box all the way to the right. And then we're gonna times that by 113 divided by the slope rating. So 113 is the base slope. So a very difficult golf course, the slope's going to be like 150. And for some easier courses, like the easiest slope is going to be is 113. So this is the basic calculation, and this is, I can see you can scroll down. Oh, that's just for 9-hole scores. So that is going to be how your score differential is posted, and over time, based on the number of scores that you have posted. Let me go to the next spot here. So the handicap. So a handicap index is calculated from the lowest score differential in the lowest score in the scoring record. If a scoring record contains fewer than 20 score differentials, the table below is used to determine the number of score differentials to be included in that calculation and any adjustment. So traditionally, your handicap is based on your best 8 scores over your last 20. And if you have fewer than 20 scores, it may take less than that. I know getting a little wordy here. You asked for a simple explanation, but essentially it's the things that are coming into play with calculating it is the score you shot, the slope and rating, or the slope and the rating for the tees that you played, and then over time what that trend is.
So the slope and the course rating are different things.
Correct. So you'll see on the scorecard, the course rating is going to be a number that will look closer to par. So it'll be like 72 point something or 68 point something. And then the slope will be a 3-digit number. The difficult slope will be 140 plus, and then the lowest possible slope is 113.
Yeah, now that you say that, I definitely remember seeing those different numbers.
So both of those are involved in that calculation. And that's determined by basically just a bunch of different measurements, like physical measurements based on how wide fairways are, how long holes are, where bunkers are, where penalty areas are. Like Maryland Stake Golf Association is going to come out, I think, at the end of March, early April. Whenever all the turf is down on the blue course, and they're going to go out and do all those measurements and produce slope and rating from all the tees. So it's a calculation. It's not based on actual play of the course.
Very interesting. I have one more question unless someone else is here and has another question.
Yeah, I don't have any more, so keep them coming.
Okay. All right. It's kind of a funny one. Is there a max score per hole? I heard someone say for their high school scoring, they would do double par would be the maximum. And I thought that was a decent way to cap each one. But in terms of the actual handicapping scoring system, is there any? Is it unlimited per hole? How does that work?
So it's the way it's calculated is and the reason that this is in place in terms of max score is that they don't want you having a really bad hole to artificially inflate your overall score and potentially make your handicap go up higher than it should.
Right.
And so the calculation is what we call net double bogey. And the way you determine what net double bogey is, if you think back to that stroke index allocation I was talking about, it's whatever the par of that hole was plus 2 strokes. So whatever the double bogey score is. And then you were going to add any additional handicap strokes that you would have received on that hole. So the example of an 18 handicap player, right? They receive 1 stroke a hole. Let's say on the 5th hole is a par 4 and they got a 12 on it, right? They totally blew up. When they post their score, instead of putting a 12 for that hole, they're going to put the par. So it was a par 4, add 2 for double bogey, so 6. And then they're an 18 handicap. They would have gotten 1 additional stroke. So they're going to add that. So they would post a 7 instead of a 12. And that, again, is to keep from that one particular bad hole from inflating the rest of the round. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions. Love it. Awesome. If there's nothing else, thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And look forward to seeing you at the club soon. Hopefully we can be out playing golf and back to normal in some capacity shortly. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.